Morning, everyone. Today, I want to take you on a journey into my childhood, back to when I looked something like this. Yep, yep, I know, I know. Anyway, back to 1998, into the story that probably more so than any other inspired my love of literature, of books. Honestly, this is probably the story that set me on the path to becoming a teacher. But this isn't a video about a book, a TV show, or even a movie. Today's lesson is about a video game, and that game is none other than Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Released in 1998 for the Nintendo 64, Ocarina of Time was the first 3D entry in the Zelda series. At the time, it was a huge leap forward for graphics and gameplay and game design. Even today, many look back on it as one of the greatest video games ever created. I am certainly of that opinion. But before we dive into the game, there's some vocabulary that we need to address. Video games have their own unique way of telling stories, just like movies or books. And Ocarina of Time has a lot to teach us about what it means to be a hero and about how video games tell stories. As one of the first 3D games ever created, this was a huge step forward in how video games tell stories. So, the first term that we want to look at is third person perspective. This means that the player sees the world from behind or above the character, rather than through their eyes like you would in a first-person game. We'll be talking about those tomorrow. Examples would include the recent Final Fantasy VII remake, GTA 5, which I know many of you like, and the game we'll be talking about today, Ocarina of Time. But the term applies to books too. Take, for example, The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. In The Lottery, we see the story from the outside. Let's take a look at this example from The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. It says, when he arrived in the square, carrying the black wooden box, there was a murmur of conversation among the villagers, and he waved and called, "Little late today, folks." The postmaster, Mr. Graves, followed him, carrying a three-legged stool, and the stool was put in the center of the square, and Mr. Summers set the black box down on it. So notice pronouns like he and proper nouns like Mr. Graves. We don't have an I telling the story in the way that we have Star using I. It's from Star's perspective. That's first person. But in The Lottery, we have third person. There's no individual who we're seeing things through. It's all on the outside. One of the questions I want you to consider today is this: how does the perspective of a video game or a story change the way that it tells that story? So how would The Hate You Give be different if it were told in third person? And if you're comfortable, how would Ocarina of Time be different if it were a first person game? Or if you have a game that you want to write about, think about maybe it's a first person game. How would it look different if you put it in third person? How would that change the way that the story is told? The second term that we need to understand the game that we're going to be talking about today is silent protagonist. In video games, a silent protagonist is a player character who lacks any dialogue for the entire duration of a game, with the possible exception of occasional interjections or short phrases. So this is a character that doesn't really talk, doesn't have lines. All the other characters in the story you imagine have lines written for them, but this silent protagonist, the main character, doesn't say anything. So examples would include the main character from Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, Crash Bandicoot, and Link from Ocarina of Time. So the other question I want you to think about today is this: what effect does a silent protagonist have on a story? How is a story different with a silent protagonist than it would be with a main character who has lines? So what would this game be like if Link talked? How would that be different? Okay, with that out of the way, let's dive in. The first thing that you see when you start Ocarina of Time is a name entry screen. Off the bat, this tells you something. This makes a statement. You get to make this story your own. You're naming the character. I'm going to go with Link because I'm a purist, but I could just as easily use my own name or the name of a character from a different game. I can make it whatever I want it to be. As the game begins, we read the words of the great Deku Tree, who protects the Kokiri Forest. We learn that the people of the forest all have fairy companions except for one, Link. The Great Deku Tree says that evil forces are coming to the land of Hyrule, and that it is, quote, time for the boy without a fairy to begin his journey. Now might be a good time to remind you of something that we learned about at the very beginning of this unit, the hero's journey. Most hero stories follow a similar pattern, and this one is no different. As the Great Deku Tree declares that it is time for the boy without a fairy to begin his journey, we know that we have just heard the call to adventure, when the main character finds out that they have some greater purpose, that they have to go on a journey, they have to go out on this adventure. So Navi the fairy goes to wake up Link, who is told to visit the Great Deku Tree to learn what he has to do. So as a part of this call, the hero has to prepare. You don't just leave on an epic journey with no supplies. So he gets some assistance from Navi the fairy. Second part of the hero's journey is usually there's someone along to help the hero on their way. So the player has to find a sword and a shield. Before progressing, you try to go see the Great Deku Tree, but this guy named Milo is like, no, you can't go. You're a wimp. You need a sword and a shield. So you go out and you have to figure this out. So in a book, you might read of how the adventurer goes and purchases a shield and a sword from a merchant. But in Ocarina of Time, the player has to actually go around and collect enough money to afford one. Just like having to enter my name at the beginning of the game, having to spend time collecting money to buy a shield makes it feel like this is not just Link's adventure, but mine as well. That feeling is something that only video games can do. After gearing up, Link journeys into the Great Deku Tree to help break the curse that has been cast on it. This is the game's first dungeon, a collection of puzzles and fights that the player must overcome in order to move the story forward. Unlike a book or a movie, the story cannot move forward without the participation of the player. If I do not solve the puzzle, Link doesn't solve the puzzle. I know this particular dungeon like the back of my own hand, but when I was a kid, it took me quite a while. This time it took me less than 10 minutes, but when I was a kid, it probably took me an hour. Once the evil is vanquished, Link learns more about the crisis facing Hyrule. The Great Deku Tree passes away despite our efforts. One is told to visit Princess Zelda at Hyrule Castle. And the call to adventure and assistance parts of the hero's journey are complete. All that's left now is departure, setting out on the journey, leaving the familiar, comfortable home of the Kokiri Forest to go out into the wild. Before leaving, though, Link must say goodbye to his childhood friend, Saria, who gives him an ocarina, which becomes very important later in the game. This marks Link's departure as he crosses from the familiar world of Kokiri Forest to the vast world of Hyrule Field. It may not look like much now, but when I first stepped into Hyrule Field as a 6-year-old kid, it blew my mind. Racing across the field to reach the castle before dark and the drawbridge goes up, locking you out to fight enemies in the dark, is still thrilling today, almost 22 years later. Link finds Princess Zelda after evading guards in the castle. And learns of the quest that awaits him. After learning about the quest that awaits him, Link is escorted out of the castle by Zelda's attendant and looks out on Hyrule Field, his challenges and trials in front of him and in front of us. That's where we'll leave him, on the threshold of his adventure. I definitely suggest you go along with him on it one day. Over the years, I've often tried to figure out what made Ocarina of Time so special to me. The fact that it was so groundbreaking and new and that I was so young was definitely a part of it. It was one of the first experiences that I had with a story that really captured my imagination. But I also think that this has something to do with our two vocabulary terms, third person perspective and the silent protagonist. The fact that Link never speaks let me become Link. Other characters talk to him, but he never replies. So I filled in those gaps in my mind. Characters like Zelda, Navi, Impa, Ganondorf, and Darunia became living, breathing people in my young imagination. My experience with Ocarina of Time was completely my own. I got to create it with the game. If you were to play it, the game would help you create your own world too. When Link scrounged for rubies to buy a shield, or vanquished an enemy, or rode on a horse across a deserted field, it really felt like I was doing those things. But because the game is in third person, it was always still clear that Link and I were separate from one another. Link was my bridge into the world of Hyrule, and Ocarina of Time let me be a part of a much larger story and world without letting me forget that I was only a visitor. When I put my controller down, much like when I put down a good book, Hyrule would continue on in my imagination while I went out to live in my own world, having learned from Link's example. I think this is what made me fall in love with stories. They take us to incredible new places filled with inspiring and memorable characters. They show us heroes that we can learn from. But video games take that just one step farther. In Ocarina of Time, I was the hero. Okay, before you go, I want to circle back to those big questions from before. First, how does the perspective of a video game or novel change the way it tells its story? For example, how would Ocarina of Time be different if it were in first person, where you see through the character's eyes? Or how would The Hate You Give be different if it were told in third person instead of first? Second question, what effect does a silent protagonist have on a story? How is the story different with a silent protagonist, one that doesn't speak, than it would be with a main character who has lines? Give me 3 to 4 sentences at least in your answer to those questions, and then you'll be wrapped up for the day. I hope you enjoyed that. I had a lot of fun making this. This is the first time I've done something like this, so I hope you enjoyed it. Tomorrow I'll be going over kind of the other side of the coin. Today we talked about third person. Tomorrow we'll talk about first. Today we talked about a silent protagonist. Tomorrow we'll talk about a protagonist that is very well written, that has a lot of lines and that speaks. We'll think about the differences between third and first, silent and written. We'll think about what these games have to teach us about what it means to be a hero, and what they had to teach us about how video games can tell us stories in a completely unique way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow.